Is butt wink good or bad? Today I'm going to answer that question. Now first I'm going to explain what butt wink actually is. Come over here and I'm going to show you on Mr. Skeleton Man. Butt wink is what happens at the bottom of the squat when you get all the way down and the pelvis posteriorly rotates. So that's this way, and that's associated with another movement at the lumbar spine. So right now with a neutral pelvis, you can see that's a neutral lumbar spine. But then when the posterior tilt occurs, the lumbar spine goes into lumbar flexion. Under load, which is the barbell on your back, some people say it's a problem, some people say it's not. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Firstly, talking about the scientists and the physiotherapists that say it's not a problem. The discussion is spines are designed to move and bend and twist, and I agree, they are. But then you've got the people that oppose that opinion, and they say if you bend and load and twist the discs repeatedly, they are non-adaptive tissue. So I'm not saying which side is right or wrong, I'm saying what the arguments are. So some people say they do adapt, and therefore you should train it gradually and strengthen that structure and strengthen that movement. And it doesn't matter if you butt wink, so what? Continue to get it stronger and you'll be fine and you'll be better prepared for life. But then the science community that says all of the discs of the spine are non-adaptive tissue because they are avascular. There is very little blood supply. So therefore, in time, after a certain amount of repetitions of flexion and rotation under load, it ends up wearing away and becomes problematic. Now, I'm not for or against any of those. I'm all about performance and I let the rehab specialists look after that. But I'm going to tell you from a rehab standpoint, I work towards that not happening because I believe that when you posteriorly tilt in a squat, it is considered a leakage of energy. So I'm going to teach you how to squat and avoid butt wink. If you want to learn about the rehab side of it, I can give you a few references that you can learn about in the link in my bio. Not in the link in the bio, in the description. I'll give you a few references so that you can do your own research, but I'm going to be talking about this purely from a performance standpoint, and my opinion on the matter is I work towards it not happening because I believe that it's stronger if it doesn't happen. If it does happen from time to time and it doesn't cause pain, I won't sit there and stop you from doing your squats and say you're a bad person or you're doing the wrong thing and that needs to stop immediately, but I will still always work towards it not happening. Now today, while I do my squats, I'm going to be warming up. I'm going to be doing low bar squats, but recently my favorite warm up for that is stiletto squats because I've injured my quadricep and I want to put direct blood into the quadricep, let it work. So you're just going to watch me very, very quickly warm up to, I don't know, about 200 kilograms for a stiletto squat, 1 rep at a time. And then I'm going to show you all the techniques that I use to help you avoid butt wink. Let's do it. All right, let's do it. Let's not die, and let's do 2 reps. Down, getting it down, down, getting it down, getting it down, 3. So fresh, so pretty, she fucked that question and arresting me in the mind. This bitch is fine, I came to the club about 50 days. That's a really nice warm up for me. It targets the quads exactly. 200 kilograms stiletto squat for 2 reps. That's a little bit up from where I tore my quadriceps. So I'm feeling good. I'm feeling confident that my quad's gonna hold up when I do a low bar squat. So now you're gonna watch me warm up to my top set of low bar squats. Let's go. I'll show you what a walk in the park looks like. Are we ready? If something wrong happens, zero reaction, please and thank you. And let me do my thing. Ready? Okay, let's go. Come on, come on, come on. All right, that was very comfortable. Anyway, so let's talk about butt wink. Here are a few of the tips that I have to help you avoid butt wink. Firstly, you have to understand butt wink happens at full depth. And what we want to do is squat as deep as our mobility allows. So what does that mean? That means up until we go into butt wink, that's when we're too deep. So no butt wink, neutral spine, but the moment we get into that butt wink, that means we're beyond what our mobility allows. So that means you're gonna squat as deep as you can while still maintaining a neutral position. But the fact is, in a powerlifting competition, they don't care about butt wink or your posture or structure or whatever. They care about a standard, which is the crease of the hip must be below the top of the knee. And if you're not, then your squat is not counted because it's too high. Therefore, if you're in a powerlifting competition, you need to learn how to achieve that depth without hurting yourself and while still being able to lift the heaviest weight possible. So the first things are how to brace correctly. Bracing is about contracting those abdominal muscles. Breath hold contributes to that as well. But one of the biggest things that people do that's a big error with butt wink that causes butt wink is they anteriorly rotate their pelvis to force so that they don't go into butt wink. So they push extra hard in this direction. However, they're doing themselves a disservice. I'll tell you why. Because what happens is the hip joint, which is the thigh bone, which is the femur, sits inside the socket. So it's a ball and socket joint, sits inside the pelvis. And right now here, that's 0 degrees of hip extension, or hip flexion, I should say. And we have a certain amount of degrees of hip flexion available to us before we hit the end range of motion, that's structure on structure. And then to go deeper than that, the pelvis needs to come with it. And that's exactly what happens. So if you start, so this is neutral pelvis and 0 degrees of hip flexion. Now, if I go anteriorly rotate my pelvis, that's kind of like if the femur stays straight down and you're arching your tail this way. So that means you've taken up a few valuable degrees of hip joint flexion just by standing straight and arching your tail. A great test to see this is lean up against the wall and flex your hip. See how much range of motion you get. Now, arch your tail and flex your hip and see that the range of motion is less. Go neutral and flex the hip. My knee can come up higher. That's because I have a neutral pelvis position. So that's the start point, is figuring out where the neutral pelvis is. So if you're arching to begin with, that's going to force you to, boom, go into butt wink at the bottom. So there's tip number one, is start with the pelvis in the correct position. Now, I'm going to talk about how to brace in combination with that pelvis position. So think about the core. There's so many different muscles around the core, but a lot of people really think about the six-pack muscles. So let's talk about the six-pack muscles. They're the rectus abdominis. They attach from the bottom of the rib cage to that front of the pelvis here. They come all the way down. Now, what a muscle does is it grabs origin and insertion and it pulls those 2 points together when they contract. So when you're trying to arch your tail like this, you're stretching those muscles. You're not contracting those muscles. So think about, what does it feel like to contract those muscles? What I like to say is, imagine someone's going to punch you in the guts and you need to contract those muscles to protect yourself. How do you do it? Do you stretch it like this? No, because if you do, that's gonna hurt. You contract, which is where you bring your rib cage towards your pelvis. So this is where you hear the cue, ribs down. So when you arch your tail, that's often paired with flared ribs. So the two cues that go hand in hand is ribs down and piss up a wall. Pissing up a wall is posteriorly rotating your pelvis to the neutral position. So that's the most important part about the brace, to prepare yourself for a squat to allow for maximum range of motion without going to butt wink. The next thing we need to think about with our stance is everybody's stance is going to be slightly different. And that depends not so much on your bone length, but rather your hip joint structure. So what I mean by that is everybody has different shape femur. So that's the head of the femur, which is the ball, as well as how deep that socket is. So if you've got a very shallow socket, you get a lot of movement. If you've got a very deep hip socket, then you've got more stability, but much less mobility. So less movement. So therefore, if you have shallow hip sockets and a lot of great mobility, you'd probably be able to stand with a really wide stance and squat really deep and you have no problem. But if you don't have that hip structure, that's typically where you really need to be figuring out the optimal depth for you. Now, some people's hip shapes prefer that they squat with a narrow stance, which I've got athletes that prefer this stance. But a lot of people, I like to say a general start point is feet just outside of hip width, toes pointed very slightly outwards. Now, for me, I'm a little bit wider than that. If you notice, my squat stance is probably around here. Now, the reason I do that is because the cue that I give is to stand wide enough to allow room for your pelvis to achieve that bottom position and remain neutral. Okay, so have a look here. So this is what I consider to be roughly my comfortable stance, and I'm bracing, bang, and I'm holding that brace and coming down as deep as my mobility allows. That's me attempting to not butt wink. Maybe there's a little bit of butt wink, but when I brace with the barbell on my back, it's a little bit better. But think about that. Okay, so this is me trying to be as neutral as possible and avoid butt wink. Now, when I bring my stance in closer, so I'm standing right here now, so have a look at the difference. Because I'm not giving my pelvis room to achieve that bottom position, I feel like I can't really achieve that same depth unless I really round my back. So standing a little bit wider is where I figured out is the best position for me to be able to achieve that bottom position and not butt wink. The next thing you need to think about with that stance is most people, not all people, get more range of motion in hip joint flexion when we have some abduction. So that's abduction. So that's abduct, that's adduct. So that's abduction with our hip joint. Abduction combined with flexion, so is this. So that's open hip position, or a cue that you might hear me use a lot is knees out. So if my knees come in, I'm minimizing the amount of hip joint flexion I have access to. When I point my toes out and allow my knees to come out, that's called hip joint flexion and abduction. And that gives me more range of motion. So there's two very important parts of avoiding butt wink. One being brace, two being stance. I should say three is understanding how to keep your hips open and move into that bottom position. Now I'm going to show you one more tool that you can use that's going to allow a deeper squat and avoid butt wink. Footwear. So have a look at my footwear. These are my boxing shoes. It's a relatively flat-soled shoe, and I like these when I'm doing a hip dominant squat because the flat-soled shoe allows me to have more of a forward torso lean and push my hips back so that I can use my hips a little bit more. So have a look at the range of motion that I get with flats. Now, this is the alternative to a flat-soled shoe. They are a weightlifting shoe. So there's lots of different brands. These ones are Nike. They're pretty good. I don't really care. I like Adidas as well, but there's lots of other great brands. But what this is a built-in heel that's about 3/4 of an inch. Now, without having to put those on, and not everyone wants to buy a pair of shoes, I recommend you do if you are into squatting. But an alternative to that is just elevating your heels with a weight plate. So have a look at how I squat without the weight plate with flat-soled shoes. Now, elevating my heels, doing the exact same thing, allows me to achieve a little bit more depth and maintain that neutral posture. So that means that if you want to avoid butt wink and you can't achieve that bottom position without a flat-soled shoe, if you're doing a low bar squat like in powerlifting, that's when I would recommend an elevated heel shoe, like a weightlifting shoe. alternatively, if you have a look at the warm-up exercise that I did, it was the Stiletto squat, which is an even thicker heel. Look how exaggerated that is. So these ones here are about an inch, which is pretty similar to what the weightlifting shoe is. But have a look at this, which is what I'm doing my Stiletto squats with. This allows way more depth. The more the heel elevates, the more it allows your knee to travel forward, which increases the range of motion available so that you can achieve a deeper position and maintain a neutral pelvis angle. So that's my take on how to avoid butt wink. So now let's recap the 3 tips to avoid butt wink, starting with the brace. That is starting with a neutral pelvis position and putting your ribs down. So piss up a wall and ribs down so that you can think about contracting your abs as if you're getting punched in the belly. That's how you position your pelvis in the optimal position for maximum range of motion in hip joint flexion. Tip 2, stance width. If you don't know your stance, it's about trial and error. I like to teach people to start with your toes just outside of hip width, toes pointed very slightly outwards. From here, open your hips and sit into that bottom position. Wherever you feel, make the adjustments, wherever you feel most comfortable. For me, with a flat-soled shoe, this is where I get the most comfort and the most range of motion in my squat. So you need to stand in a stance that's comfortable for you. And then last but not least, this is the easiest fix that you can use for anybody to improve their mobility and their range of motion in their squat. If you don't have an elevated heel weightlifting shoe, you can use a weightlifting plate and adjust the thickness of the plate to pair with your mobility to allow for as deep as possible without butt wink. That's all. Now you know my 3 tips for avoiding butt wink. Click like, subscribe, all that stuff, and I'll see you guys next time.